The stickiness started with a dinner, a well-meaning but horribly misguided family dinner. I could feel it from the moment I shook her hand, Jane, Dan's older sister. A control freak wrapped in a cashmere sweater and a forced smile. It was a spiderweb being spun, and I, Amelia, was the unfortunate fly blundering right into it. Dan had warned me. She can be intense, he'd said, downplaying the reality of her obsessive personality. But nothing could have prepared me for the third degree she launched, within minutes of me sitting down. "So, Amelia," she purred, her eyes too bright, too knowing. "Dan tells us you're a teacher? How charming. What does your father do?" My hackles rose. Why did she need to know what my father did? He was gone anyway. A messy, painful part of my past that I rarely talked about. "He passed away a long time ago," I mumbled, picking at my salad. Jane's eyes gleamed. "Oh, how tragic. And your mother?" I just told her the truth. She worked as a sales associate. I hated the judgmental glint in her eyes, like my whole life was somehow inferior to her. The evening continued in that vein, each question designed to subtly undermine me, to find a flaw, a crack in my armor. I taught at the same underfunded school as Dan? How noble. Did I realize the sacrifices he was making? Did I cook? Did I have plans for marriage and children? When? How many? Like she had a say in any of it. It felt like an interrogation, not a welcoming introduction. Dan, bless his heart, tried to steer the conversation, but Jane was relentless, a shark circling its prey. "She's just protective," Dan said later as we drove home. I stared out the window, trying to shake off the feeling of being dissected and found wanting. Protective? It felt more like possessive. I wanted to believe him, wanted to chalk it up to nerves. Meeting the family was a big deal, but something about Jane's intensity, her almost predatory gaze, left a chill deep in my bones. I didn't know it then, but that dinner was the beginning of a nightmare, a slow burn of manipulation and resentment that would eventually threaten everything I held dear. Dan and I were happy. We had a cozy little apartment, we loved our jobs, and we were building a life together. But Jane was a constant shadow, lurking in the corners, whispering doubts, trying to pry us apart. She showed up unannounced, critiqued my cooking, rearranged our furniture, offered unsolicited advice on everything from our finances to our future. Dan tried to set boundaries, but she ignored them, playing the wounded sister, accusing me of turning him against his family. His parents were complicit. They'd dealt with Jane's behavior for so long, they'd become resigned, offering weak apologies and excuses instead of confronting her. "That's just Jane," they'd say, as if that excused her blatant disrespect. I tried. I invited her to coffee, offered to help with her errands, attempted to bridge the gap, but nothing worked. Her resentment was a festering wound, and I was the salt she kept rubbing into it. "She just wants to be included," Dan insisted. But I knew better. Jane didn't want to be included. She wanted to control. She wanted to orchestrate, to dictate, to ensure that everything, including Dan's life, revolved around her. The engagement was a turning point. When Dan proposed, Jane's simmering resentment boiled over. She accused me of trapping him, of manipulating him, of not being good enough for him. The wedding was a battlefield. She tried to commandeer the planning, arguing that as Dan's sister, she had a right to control every detail. She wore white to the ceremony, a blatant act of defiance. And during her toast, she regaled the guests with embarrassing stories from Dan's childhood, ending with a veiled jab at my supposed shortcomings. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell her to go to hell, but I held it in for Dan's sake. He was mortified, furious, but he begged me to let it go, to not let her ruin our day. And I did. But the damage was done. Jane had drawn a line in the sand, and the war had officially begun. Marriage didn't mellow Jane. It seemed to embolden her, to fuel her obsession with control. She became a fixture in our lives, an unwelcome presence that I couldn't seem to shake. I started locking the doors, pretending we weren't home when she showed up unannounced. She'd stand outside, pounding on the door, peering through the windows, calling Dan incessantly. Then came the guilt-tripping texts, the accusations of being cold and unwelcoming. Dan's parents, caught in the middle, offered weak defenses, urging us to be understanding, to make allowances for Jane's eccentricities. She's family, they'd say, as if that excused everything. I was starting to crack. The constant pressure, the incessant negativity, the feeling of being constantly judged and undermined. It was taking its toll. Then came the news. I was pregnant. Dan and I were ecstatic. We'd been trying for a while, and when that little line turned blue, I burst into tears of joy. We decided to wait until after the first trimester to announce it, wanting to be sure everything was okay. I hoped, foolishly, that a baby might change things. That Jane, faced with the reality of becoming an aunt, would finally let go of her resentment and embrace me. Embrace us. We announced it at a family dinner at Dan's parents' house. The room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Dan's parents were overjoyed. Kim and Andy were genuinely happy for us. And Jane actually hugged me. A real, genuine hug. I was stunned. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to change. Then came dessert. Jane stood up, a wine glass in her hand, her eyes gleaming with a disturbing intensity. "Since this is Mom and Dad's first grandchild," she announced, her voice ringing with self-importance, "I think we need to talk about names." My stomach dropped. I knew where this was going. She launched into a speech about family traditions, about honoring her grandmother, Elizabeth, a woman I'd never met. "I've always dreamed of naming my first niece or nephew after Grandma Elizabeth," she declared. Dan and I exchanged a nervous glance. We'd already decided on names. If it was a boy, we'd name him after Dan's grandfather, Joe. If it was a girl, we were naming her May, after my grandmother. My grandmother, May, the woman who raised me after my parents died, who worked 2 jobs to put me through school, who was my rock, my everything. She had passed away just last year, after a long battle with cancer, and honoring her by naming my daughter after her meant the world to me. Dan cleared his throat. "Actually, Jane," he said gently, "we've already decided on names. If it's a girl, we're naming her May, after Amelia's grandmother." The temperature in the room plummeted. Jane's face hardened, her eyes narrowed. "May?" she spat, as if the name itself was an insult. "What kind of name is that?" "No one in our family is named May." I tried to explain, to tell her about my grandmother, about how important she was to me, but she cut me off. "This is the first grandchild in our family," she shouted, her voice rising. "It should have a name from our family traditions." Dan's mom tried to intervene. "Jane, honey," she said soothingly. "May sounds like a beautiful name, and it's their baby. They get to decide." That's when Jane completely lost it. She slammed her wine glass down on the table, shattering it into a million pieces. Red wine and shards of glass sprayed everywhere. "She comes into this family," she screamed, her voice filled with venom, "and just throws away all our traditions. That's so disrespectful." Then she turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "Your grandmother wasn't even your real parent," she snarled. "So it doesn't matter as much as honoring our family's actual grandmother." The room went silent. I gasped, tears welling up in my eyes. Who says that to someone whose parents died when they were a kid? Dan jumped up, his face contorted with rage. "Jane, apologize right now," he roared. Instead, she grabbed her purse, knocked over her chair, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the picture fell off the wall. Karen tried to comfort me, but I was beyond consolation. Dan and his dad, Tom, started arguing about Jane's behavior, with Tom making weak excuses, trying to downplay her cruelty. The rest of the night was a blur of awkward silences and forced smiles. We left as soon as we could, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken emotions. "I'm so sorry," Dan said, his voice filled with guilt. "I've never seen her that bad before. I was still crying, partly from the shock of what she'd said, partly from the surge of pregnancy hormones that amplified every emotion tenfold." "It's okay?" I choked out. But it wasn't okay. It was far from okay. Jane had crossed a line, and I knew with a chilling certainty that things would never be the same again. The naming game had become a battle, a fight for control that I didn't even realize I was in until it was too late. Over the next few weeks, Jane waged a relentless campaign to undermine my choice, to pressure us into naming our daughter Elizabeth. She called every member of Dan's family, spreading lies and exaggerations, painting me as a disrespectful outsider who was trying to erase their family history. She even called my school principal, trying to get me in trouble, claiming I was unfit to teach. Luckily, he saw through her charade and dismissed her complaint. Dan's parents, as always, were caught in the middle, calling us to mediate, suggesting compromises, urging us to consider Jane's feelings. "Maybe you could use Elizabeth as a middle name?" Karen suggested, her voice hesitant. "She's just very emotional about family traditions," Tom added, trying to sound reasonable. I was losing my patience. I loved Dan, but his family was driving me insane. Their inability to confront Jane, their constant need to appease her, was pushing me to the breaking point. The baby shower was a disaster. Jane showed up uninvited, bringing a gift, a baby blanket with the name Elizabeth embroidered on it. She presented it with a saccharine smile, making a point of embarrassing me in front of all my friends. I started avoiding family gatherings, dreading any encounter with Jane. But she was relentless, a constant presence that I couldn't escape. Then came Dan's dad's birthday dinner. I didn't want to go, but Dan felt obligated, and I didn't want to leave him to face Jane alone. I was 5 months pregnant and had been taking prenatal vitamins prescribed by my doctor. They were large horse pill-sized, but they had the right nutrients for the baby's development. I had to take them every day at 7 p.m., so I brought them with me. I put my purse in the guest room, where we usually leave our things during family events. The dinner started out surprisingly well. Jane was pointedly ignoring me, which, frankly, was a welcome change. I tried to relax, to enjoy the evening, but a knot of anxiety remained in my stomach. Around 7 p.m., I excused myself to take my medication. I went to the guest room, opened my purse, and shook out a pill. It looked different. A slightly different shade of pink, a bit smaller than usual. I paused, a flicker of unease washing over me, but I dismissed it. It was probably just the lighting in the room, or my pregnancy brain playing tricks on me. I'd been taking these pills for months. I knew what they looked like. I swallowed the pill with some water and went back to dinner. About an hour later, I started feeling strange. A wave of dizziness washed over me, followed by nausea and blurred vision. Then came the cramps, sharp, stabbing pains in my abdomen, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I grabbed Dan's arm, whispering, "Something's wrong." He looked at me, his eyes widening with alarm. My face had gone pale, and I was sweating profusely. He told his parents we needed to go to the hospital, and helped me up. I could barely walk, the cramps were intensifying, and I was terrified. I felt like I was losing the baby. Jane was watching me, her expression curious. Not concerned like everyone else, but almost intrigued, like she was waiting to see what would happen. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Dan was speeding, and I was trying not to throw up or pass out. The cramps were excruciating, and I was convinced I was miscarrying. At the ER, they took me back immediately, asking a barrage of questions. What had I eaten? Had I fallen? What medications was I taking? I mentioned the prenatal vitamins, and the doctor asked to see them. Dan said they were at his parents' house, and described them in detail. The doctor looked concerned and ordered blood tests. While we waited for the results, Dan called his parents, telling them what was happening. Karen immediately went to the guest room to retrieve my pill bottle. That's when the world exploded. Karen called back a few minutes later, her voice hysterical. She'd found my actual prenatal vitamins, hidden behind some books on the bookshelf in the guest room. The pill bottle in my purse had been switched. The blood tests confirmed it. There was a dangerous substance in my system, something that could cause serious complications in pregnancy. The doctor told me point blank that if we hadn't come to the hospital when we did, I could have lost the baby. Dan's dad searched the house and found an empty prescription bottle in Jane's purse. It contained the exact medication that was now coursing through my veins. When Dan's dad confronted her, Jane didn't deny it. She actually said, Maybe now she'll understand the importance of family traditions. Dan called the police immediately. I spent the night in the hospital, being monitored and treated. Every time I felt a cramp, I'd panic, convinced that I was losing the baby. The doctors kept checking the heartbeat, and every time I heard that little thump, I'd burst into tears of relief. Dan was beside himself with guilt and anger, blaming himself for not protecting me. His parents arrived at the hospital, their faces etched with grief and horror, apologizing over and over. The police arrived, took my statement, and said they'd be arresting Jane. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a nightmare, like some twisted movie plot, not reality. But it was real. Jane had tried to harm my baby. Because of a name. The days that followed were a whirlwind of police interviews, hospital visits, and emotional breakdowns. The relief that the baby was safe was overshadowed by the horror of what Jane had done, and the chilling details that emerged during the investigation. The pills she'd switched mine with weren't just any medication. They were a high dose of blood pressure medication, known to cause complications during pregnancy, specifically rapid drops in blood pressure that could lead to placental abruption and miscarriage. The doctors made it clear it was a deliberate, targeted attack. The police obtained a warrant to search Jane's apartment. What they found was chilling. A drawer full of medications, many without labels. Notebook pages filled with information on different drugs, with notes about which ones were dangerous for pregnant women. She'd meticulously researched dosages and potential side effects. Then came the computer and phone records. Her internet search history revealed a disturbing pattern of queries. What meds can cause miscarriages? How to swap pills undetected? Safest way to induce a miscarriage at 5 months? Can you poison someone with blood pressure meds? She'd been planning this for weeks, ever since the naming dinner. She'd even saved pictures of prenatal vitamins, so she could find pills that looked similar. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of anger. It was a calculated, premeditated attempt to harm my baby. The police reopened a series of complaints from a few years ago when she worked as an admin at a clinic. Complaints of people receiving the wrong medications. Nothing had ever been proven, but now, with this new evidence, the pieces were falling into place. Jane had always had a dark side, a penchant for control, and she'd been honing her skills for years. When confronted with the evidence, Jane finally confessed. Her explanation was chilling. She couldn't stand the thought of her family's first grandchild being named after an outsider, that I needed to be taught a lesson about respecting family traditions. She still tried to minimize her actions, saying she only wanted to scare me into changing my mind, as if that made it any better. She showed absolutely no remorse. Dan was shattered. He was struggling to reconcile the image of his loving sister with the cold, calculating woman who had tried to harm my child. His guilt was overwhelming. He kept replaying the past, searching for signs he'd missed, moments where he could have intervened. His parents were devastated, particularly Karen. She was consumed by guilt, confessing that Jane had exhibited disturbing behavior since childhood, destroying toys, hurting pets, controlling her siblings with threats and manipulation. They'd always brushed it off, made excuses, never sought professional help. Now they were paying the price. Kim, Dan's younger sister, finally revealed that she suspected Jane had poisoned her with something when she was younger, and she got really sick after Jane gave her a smoothie. No one ever thought too much about it. She felt that she was just sick from something, but now she knew Jane had done something. Kim had been scared to say anything because of the way Jane had a hold on them. Hearing what Jane did to me finally gave Kim the courage to speak up. The district attorney was taking the case very seriously, charging Jane with attempted assault on a pregnant woman and tampering with prescription medication. Her lawyer tried to argue temporary insanity, emotional distress, but the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. We were granted a restraining order, prohibiting Jane from contacting us or coming within 500 feet. The police advised us to install security cameras. We were living in a state of constant fear, knowing that Jane was out there, capable of anything. As for me and the baby, we were physically okay, but the emotional scars were deep. I became paranoid, triple-checking every medication before I took it. Dan started keeping my pills in a locked box. We were living in a prison of our own making, trapped by Jane's twisted obsession. I knew that Jane was not a person I could ever trust, understand, or forgive. She was a monster, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, and she had almost destroyed everything I loved. And now I had to face her. The trial was a grueling ordeal. I was 6 months pregnant, and the stress was taking its toll. But I knew I had to be there, to face Jane, to ensure that she was held accountable for her actions. Walking into the courtroom, seeing her sitting there with her lawyer, was surreal. She looked normal, composed, almost serene. It was hard to believe that this was the same woman who had tried to kill my baby. Her lawyer launched into a defense, portraying her as a kind, caring, selfless individual, a victim of circumstances, driven to a moment of madness by loneliness and grief. He talked about her failed relationships, her feelings of inadequacy, her deep-seated desire to protect her family. It was a pathetic attempt to whitewash her actions, to paint her as a sympathetic figure. Then came the prosecutor, a woman with a sharp gaze and an unwavering determination. She laid out the evidence, piece by piece, dismantling Jane's carefully constructed facade. She presented Jane's internet search history, the disturbing details of her research, the chilling notes she'd made about different medications. She read aloud text messages Jane had sent to a friend after switching the pills, taught Jen a lesson, might even lose the baby. Then they can start over with a proper name. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension. I could feel the jury's gaze shift, their expressions hardening as the truth of Jane's actions became clear. I testified, reliving the horror of that night, the fear, the pain, the sheer terror of thinking I was losing my baby. My voice shook, tears streamed down my face, but I spoke with conviction, determined to make them understand what Jane had done to me. Dan also testified, his voice filled with anger and grief. He spoke about his love for his sister, his shock and disbelief at her actions, his unwavering support for me and our baby. When it was Jane's turn to speak, she offered a hollow apology, claiming she never intended to harm the baby, that she only wanted to make a point. She spoke of her love for her family, her desire to protect their traditions, her feelings of being excluded and marginalized. It was a performance, a calculated attempt to sway the jury. But it didn't work. The evidence was too damning, the facts too clear. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, their faces were solemn, their verdict unanimous. Guilty. The judge sentenced Jane to 5 years in prison, with mandatory psychiatric counseling. As the sentence was read, Jane erupted, screaming, cursing, blaming me for ruining her life, for turning her family against her. It took 2 court officers to restrain her and drag her out of the courtroom. I sat there, numb, exhausted, but filled with a sense of relief. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but we pushed past them, wanting only to escape, to be alone, to process the trauma of the past few months. That night, Dan and I sat on our couch, in silence, for hours. The weight of what had happened pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. He finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, confessing that he felt like he'd lost his sister twice, first to her obsession with control, and now to prison. I held him, trying to offer comfort, but I was emotionally drained, still grappling with my own feelings. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But we were together, and we had our baby girl, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath of the trial was a slow, painful process of healing and rebuilding. Dan's parents were consumed by guilt, struggling to come to terms with what Jane had done. They called us frequently, offering apologies, expressing their remorse, but their words felt hollow, unable to erase the pain and betrayal. Karen, in particular, was struggling. She blamed herself for not recognizing the signs earlier, for not getting Jane the help she needed. She confessed that she was haunted by the thought that she could have prevented this tragedy, that she had failed as a mother. Tom took a leave of absence from work, overwhelmed by stress and anxiety. The doctor warned him that he was at risk of a heart attack if he didn't slow down and take care of himself. Kim moved back in with her parents to offer support and help with household chores. She confessed that she was struggling to reconcile the image of her loving sister with the woman who had tried to harm my baby. She had a lot of her own childhood trauma to deal with. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Jane's lawyer contacted us. Jane wanted to appeal the verdict, claiming new evidence of mental illness. She was now claiming to have undiagnosed bipolar disorder. We refused. The thought of prolonging this nightmare, of giving Jane another opportunity to manipulate the system, was unbearable. Then came the letter from Jane herself, a bizarre mix of apology and justification. She claimed she never intended to harm the baby, that she only wanted to make a point, that the medication wasn't that strong. The whole letter was a lie. She didn't take responsibility for her actions. We returned a letter unopened, with return to sender scrawled across the envelope. We decided to expedite our plans to move out of state. Dan had been offered a position at a private school 2 hours away, and we wanted a fresh start, away from the constant reminders of what had happened. Finding a house, packing, and moving while 7 months pregnant was exhausting, but the prospect of a new beginning was invigorating. We made sure our new address wasn't public. As my due date approached, my anxiety intensified. I couldn't shake the fear that Jane had somehow damaged the baby, that something would go wrong. The doctor scheduled an induction, but I went into labor the night before. After 18 hours of grueling contractions, our baby girl arrived, May Elizabeth. The moment they placed her in my arms, the world transformed. The pain, the fear, the anger, it all faded away, replaced by an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness. I held her close, gazing at her tiny face, her delicate features, her perfect little fingers and toes. She was perfect, and she was ours. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Jane, bearing a prison return address. Inside were magazine clippings of baby photos, with the chilling question scrawled across the top, "Is this what my niece looks like?" We traced the leak. A distant cousin, eager to share news of the baby, had unwittingly provided Jane with the information she craved. We immediately cut off contact with the cousin and alerted the prison authorities. Jane's mail was flagged. We focused on May, determined to create a safe and loving environment for her, despite the darkness that lingered in the background. 4 months into our new life, things started to feel normal-ish. The fear was still there. The anxiety still simmered beneath the surface, but we were learning to cope, to rebuild, to find joy in the everyday moments. Jane continued to write, sending letters filled with apologies and justifications, begging for forgiveness. We ignored them, adding them to a growing pile of unopened correspondence. Forgiveness was a luxury I couldn't afford. May's safety and well-being were my priority, and I wouldn't risk jeopardizing that for anything. People asked why we chose Elizabeth as May's middle name, given everything that had happened. Some thought it was a sign of weakness, a concession to Jane. But it was the opposite. Elizabeth was Dan's grandmother's name too, not just Jane's pick. She had no right to steal the beauty and history of the name away from us. We refused to let Jane taint that connection, to allow her to erase Elizabeth from our family history. May Elizabeth. It was a beautiful name, a tribute to 2 strong, loving women, one who raised me and one who helped raise Dan. Elizabeth also honored my grandma too. My grandmother's middle name was Elizabeth, a name that belonged to our family, not to Jane. I saw a comment on the old Reddit thread calling me the for not being more understanding of mental illness. Let me be clear. Mental illness might explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Jane knew exactly what she was doing. She researched medications, made detailed plans, and bragged about it afterward. She wasn't having some dissociative episode. She made calculated decisions that could have killed my baby. I have compassion for people struggling with mental health, but not when they use those issues to justify attempted murder. Years have passed since then. May is growing up fast. She knows Jane exists, but she's always known how dangerous she is. We talk about her, but we protect May's innocence as much as we can. I can tell you from now that Jane will never know May. We've built a good life for ourselves. A life filled with love, laughter, and security. We still have our struggles, our anxieties, our moments of doubt, but we face them together, stronger and more resilient than ever. Jane is still out there, a ghost in the background, a constant reminder of the darkness that exists in the world. But she doesn't have the power to hurt us anymore. We've taken back our lives, reclaimed our family, and built a future filled with hope, love, and light. And that is a victory worth fighting for. The silence in our new house was different from the silence in our old apartment. The old silence was thick with unspoken resentments, with the oppressive weight of Jane's constant presence. This silence was empty, a blank canvas, but still I didn't know how to paint a life on it. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Night after night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past few months in my head. The dinner, the baby shower, the hospital. Jane's face haunted my dreams, her eyes burning with hatred. I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced that she was in the house, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. Dan would hold me, whispering reassurances, but his own eyes held a flicker of fear. We were both living with a sense of hyper-vigilance, constantly scanning our surroundings, searching for any sign of danger. The move, while necessary, had also created a distance between us and Dan's parents. The phone calls became less frequent, the conversations more strained. They were struggling to cope with their own guilt, and I think, in some ways, they blamed us for what had happened. As if we had somehow driven Jane to her actions. Karen especially was a mess. She'd call at all hours, weeping, apologizing, confessing her deepest regrets. I tried to be patient, but her constant self-flagellation was exhausting. It felt like she was trying to absolve her own guilt by forcing me to forgive her, to tell her it was okay. But it wasn't okay, and I wasn't ready to forgive her, or Tom, or even Dan, sometimes, for his blind faith in his sister, for his inability to see the darkness that lurked beneath her charming facade. I knew it wasn't fair to blame them. They were victims too, in their own way. But the anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, poisoning my relationships. One afternoon, Karen called, her voice barely a whisper. "Amelia, honey," she sobbed, I don't know what to do. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't even get out of bed. I feel like I'm drowning." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Karen, the first understand you're hurting," I said wearily. "But I can't fix this for you. You need to get help. See a therapist. Talk to someone who can help you process your grief. BUTI, just want you to tell me it's going to be okay," she pleaded. "I want you to tell me you forgive me," my patient snapped. "Karen, I'm 7 months pregnant, dealing with the trauma of almost losing my baby and trying to rebuild my life after your daughter tried to kill her. I can't be your emotional support system right now. I need you to understand that." I hung up, my hand trembling. I hated being so harsh, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to protect myself, to prioritize my own well-being and the well-being of my child. Dan came home later that evening, his face drawn and tired. "Mom called," he said quietly. "She said you were upset with her." I braced myself for a confrontation. "Dan, I can't keep reassuring her that everything's going to be okay when it's clearly not. She needs professional help, not my forgiveness." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know," he said. "It's just, she's really struggling, and I feel like I should be doing more to help." "You are helping," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "You're being there for her. But you can't fix her. She needs to fix herself." He nodded. His eyes filled with a mixture of love and frustration. "I just wish this whole thing never happened," he said softly. "Me too," I whispered, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Me too." The weight of forgiveness was heavy, a burden I wasn't sure I could carry. Not yet, anyway. I needed time, space, and a lot of therapy to even begin to process the trauma that Jane had inflicted upon us. The installation of the security system felt less like a safety measure and more like a confirmation of our fears. Cameras sprouted from every corner of the house, their cold, unblinking eyes watching our every move. Motion sensors lined the windows and doors, ready to trigger an alarm at the slightest disturbance. The keypad on the front door required a complex code, a constant reminder that we were living in a state of siege. I hated it. It felt like we were prisoners in our own home. But Dan insisted. He needed to feel like he was doing everything possible to protect us, to prevent Jane from ever getting close again. He spent hours poring over the security footage, obsessively checking the perimeter, searching for any sign of intrusion. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that he heard something, and would rush outside, armed with a flashlight, to patrol the yard. His anxiety was contagious. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams of Jane breaking into the house, looming over my bed with a knife. One night, I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat. Dan rushed to my side, his face etched with alarm. "What's wrong?" he cried, holding me close. "What happened?" "She was here," I gasped, clinging to him. "Jane was here. She was in the house, watching us." He held me tighter, whispering soothing words, trying to calm me down. "It was just a dream," he said gently. "She's not here. She can't get to us." But I wasn't so sure. The fear was real, tangible, and it was consuming me. The security system meant to protect us was actually making things worse. It was fueling our anxiety, turning our home into a fortress, and isolating us from the outside world. I needed to talk to Dan, to tell him that we couldn't keep living like this. We couldn't let Jane control our lives, even from behind prison walls. One evening, after May had gone to bed, I sat down with Dan in the living room. He was hunched over his laptop, reviewing the security footage, his brow furrowed with concern. "Dan," I said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes filled with weariness. "What is it?" "The security system," I said, gesturing to the cameras that lined the walls. It's too much. It's making us crazy." He frowned. "But it's keeping us safe," he protested. "It's keeping us scared," I countered. "We can't live in a constant state of fear, Dan. We need to find a way to move on, to reclaim our lives." He hesitated, his expression conflicted. "But what if she gets out?" he asked. "What if she comes after us?" "We'll deal with it," I said firmly. "We'll get a restraining order. We'll call the police. But we can't let the fear of what might happen control us. We need to live our lives, Dan. For May. For ourselves." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. I could see the pain, the fear, the desperation in his gaze. But I also saw a glimmer of hope, a flicker of understanding. He closed his laptop and reached out to take my hand. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't let her win. We need to live our lives. We need to be happy." We spent the next few weeks dismantling the security system, removing the cameras, deactivating the motion sensors. It was a symbolic act, a gesture of defiance against Jane's attempt to control us. We still took precautions, of course. We kept the doors locked. We were careful about who we let into our lives. But we refused to live in a prison of fear. We started going out again, taking May to the park, visiting friends, exploring our new community. We started to laugh again, to find joy in the simple things, to reconnect with each other and with the world around us. The security system was gone, but the scars remained. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it no longer controlled us. We were learning to live with it, to manage it, to move forward, one step at a time. May's first birthday was a milestone, a celebration of life and hope after a year of turmoil and fear. We wanted to make it special, to create a day filled with love and joy, a day that would overshadow the darkness of the past. We invited a few close friends and family, people we trusted, people who had supported us through everything. We decorated the house with balloons and streamers, baked a cake, and prepared a feast of kid-friendly food. The day was perfect. May was radiant. her eyes sparkling with delight as she tore into her presents, smearing frosting all over her face. She laughed, she gurgled, she danced, and her joy was infectious. I watched her, my heart swelling with love and gratitude. She was a miracle, a testament to the strength of life, a symbol of hope in the face of despair. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Jane was always on the back of my mind. Kim, Dan's sister, approached me, her face etched with concern. "Amelia, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked quietly. I followed her into the kitchen, my heart pounding with dread. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Mom called," Kim said, her eyes darting nervously. She said Jane called her today." My breath caught in my throat. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She just wanted to know how May's birthday was," Kim said, her voice filled with disgust. "She asked if she was having a good time, if she liked her presents. She even asked if you were using Elizabeth as her middle name." Rage surged through me, a burning inferno that threatened to consume me. "How dare she?" I spat, my hands clenching into fists. "How dare she try to ruin this day?" "Mom didn't tell her anything," Kim said quickly. She hung up on her. "BUTI just thought you should know." I nodded, my mind racing. Jane was still out there, lurking in the shadows, trying to worm her way back into our lives. I needed to protect May. I needed to protect my family. I excused myself and went outside, where Dan was playing with May in the backyard. I watched them for a moment, their faces radiant with happiness, their laughter echoing through the air. I took a deep breath and walked over to them, my heart filled with love and determination. "Dan," I said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" "Jane called Mom today," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "She asked about May's birthday." His face darkened with anger. "That bitch," he muttered. "I'm going to call the prison. I'm going to report her." "That won't stop her," I said, shaking my head. "We need to do more. We need to protect May. We need to protect ourselves." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. I took a deep breath and told him my plan. It was drastic, risky, and it would require a lot of sacrifice. But I was convinced it was the only way to truly protect our family from Jane's twisted obsession. We spent the rest of the evening discussing the details, weighing the pros and cons, and preparing ourselves for the difficult road ahead. May's first birthday was a reminder of everything we had to lose, and a catalyst for a decision that would change our lives forever. We had to find a way to cut all ties. As drastic as that would be, it was the only thing we knew would keep us all safe. My plan was radical. I wanted to completely sever all ties with Dan's family. Not just Jane, but Karen, Tom, Kim, Andy, everyone. Total isolation. It sounded insane, even to me, as I voiced it aloud to Dan. But it was the only way I could see a future where we could be truly safe, where May could grow up without the shadow of Jane looming over her. "Amelia, that's impossible," Dan protested, his voice filled with disbelief. "They're my family. I can't just cut them out of my life." "I know," I said softly, "and I'm not asking you to do it lightly. But think about it, Dan. Jane is still in contact with them. She's manipulating them, using them to get information about us. As long as they're in our lives, she'll always have a way to reach us." He fell silent, his expression troubled. He knew I was right. He had seen firsthand how easily Jane could manipulate his family, how they were always willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, to make excuses for her behavior. "But what about May?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "They're her grandparents, her aunts and uncles. She deserves to know them. She deserves to be safe," I countered. "And as long as Jane is in the picture, she'll never be truly safe. We can explain it to her when she's older. Tell her the truth about Jane, about why we had to make this decision." The thought of depriving May of a relationship with her grandparents tore at my heart, but the alternative was even more terrifying. I couldn't risk Jane getting close to my daughter. I couldn't risk her poisoning May's mind, or worse, harming her physically. Dan and I spent weeks debating the issue, weighing the pros and cons, talking through our fears and concerns. It was the hardest decision we had ever had to make, a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. Finally, after much soul-searching, Dan agreed. He understood my reasons, and he shared my fears. He knew that the only way to protect May was to cut the cord, to sever all ties with his family, no matter how painful it might be. The next step was to tell them. We decided to do it in person, to explain our decision face to face, to give them a chance to understand. We drove to Dan's parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, our hearts heavy with dread. As we pulled into the driveway, I could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Karen answered the door, her face lighting up with a tentative smile. "Dan, Amelia," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Come in, come in." We were just making coffee. We stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon filling the air. The house felt smaller than I remembered, the furniture worn and faded, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken grief. Tom was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper, his face drawn and weary. He looked up as we entered, offering a weak smile. "Hey, kids," he said, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. Kim was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her eyes red and puffy. She barely glanced up as we entered. We sat down, the silence hanging heavy in the air. I could feel their eyes on us, searching our faces, sensing that something was wrong. Dan cleared his throat, his expression grave. "Mom, Dad, Kim," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk," Karen's smile faltered. "What is it, honey?" she asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Dan took a deep breath and launched into his explanation, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. He told them about our decision, about our fears for May's safety, about our need to protect her from Jane's influence. As he spoke, their faces registered a range of emotions: disbelief, anger, sadness, confusion. Karen started to cry, her sobs racking her body. Tom's face hardened, his eyes narrowed with resentment. Kim remained silent, her expression unreadable. "You can't be serious," Tom said, his voice filled with anger. "You're really going to do this? Cut us out of your lives? Just like that?" "It's not what we want," Dan said, his voice pleading. "But we have to do it. For May, for ourselves." "But we're your family," Karen cried, her voice choked with tears. "How can you do this to us? After everything we've been through?" "We're doing this because of everything we've been through," I said, my voice firm. "We can't keep living in fear, Karen. We need to move on. We need to protect our daughter." "So that's it then?" Tom said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You're just going to walk away? Pretend we don't exist?" "It's not forever," Dan said, his voice filled with hope. "Maybe someday, when Jane is gone, when we know that May is safe, we can reconnect. But for now, this is the only way." The conversation went on for hours, filled with tears, accusations, and desperate pleas. But our decision was firm. We wouldn't waver. Finally, as the sun began to set, we stood up to leave. Karen rushed towards us, grabbing Dan in a tight embrace. "Please, honey," she sobbed. "Don't do this. Don't leave us." Dan hugged her back, his eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. "But I have to do what's right for my family." We walked out the door, leaving them standing there, heartbroken and confused. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, a wave of sadness washing over me. We were cutting off a part of ourselves, severing ties that had bound us together for a lifetime. But it was a necessary sacrifice, a price we had to pay to protect the ones we loved. The silence that followed our estrangement was deafening. No phone calls, no visits, no cards in the mail. It was as if we had ceased to exist, erased from their lives, and them from ours. The first few months were the hardest. I missed Karen's phone calls, even the ones where she was weeping and apologizing. I missed Tom's gruff demeanor and his corny jokes. I missed Kim's sardonic wit and her loyal friendship. But the fear was always there, lurking beneath the surface, reminding me why we had made this decision. I couldn't risk letting them back into our lives. not when there was even the slightest chance that Jane could use them to get to May. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Dan in Karen's familiar handwriting. I hesitated, my heart pounding with dread. Was it a peace offering? A plea for reconciliation? Or something more sinister? I handed it to Dan, my hand trembling. He took it, his face etched with apprehension. He stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shrugged and ripped open the envelope. He read the letter, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "What does it say?" I asked, my anxiety mounting. He sighed and handed me the letter. It was a rambling, incoherent mess, filled with guilt, regret, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. Karen wrote about how much she missed us, how much she regretted what had happened, how she wished she could turn back time and make everything right. She also wrote about Jane, about how she had called her again, begging for information about May. Karen wrote that she had refused to tell her anything, that she had finally realized how dangerous Jane was, how she had manipulated and controlled her for years. She ended the letter with a desperate plea for us to reconsider our decision, to give her another chance, to let her back into our lives. I read the letter, my heart aching with sympathy and longing. I wanted to believe her, to trust her, to forgive her, but the fear was too strong. I couldn't risk it. "What are we going to do?" Dan asked, his voice filled with desperation. I shook my head, my eyes filled with tears. "We can't respond," I said softly. "It's too dangerous. We have to stay strong." He nodded, his expression troubled. He knew I was right, but it didn't make it any easier. Over the next few months, more letters arrived, each one more desperate than the last. Karen wrote about her loneliness, her grief, her struggles to cope with Jane's imprisonment and our estrangement. She wrote about how much she missed May, how she longed to see her, to hold her, to be a part of her life. Tom also wrote, his letters more stoic and reserved than Karen's, but just as filled with longing and regret. He wrote about how proud he was of Dan, how he admired his strength and his determination to protect his family. He also wrote about his fears for Karen, about how she was slowly losing herself in her grief. We read the letters, our hearts aching with sympathy and guilt, but we didn't respond. We couldn't. It was too risky. The letters became ghosts, haunting our lives, reminding us of the sacrifices we had made, the price we had paid to protect our family. They were a constant reminder that we were living in a self-imposed exile, separated from the people we loved by a wall of fear and distrust. As May grew older, she began to ask questions about her grandparents, her aunts and uncles. She saw other children with their grandparents, playing in the park, baking cookies in the kitchen, reading stories before bedtime. She wondered why she didn't have that. "Mommy, why don't I have grandparents?" she asked one day, her eyes filled with innocent curiosity. I froze, my heart pounding with anxiety. I knew this day would come, but I wasn't prepared for it. How could I explain to her what had happened, without scaring her, without filling her mind with fear and distrust? "You do have grandparents, sweetheart," I said softly. "They just live far away." "Why can't we visit them?" she asked, her brow furrowed with confusion. "It's complicated," I said, struggling to find the right words. "They're not very nice people, and we don't want them to hurt you." "Hurt me?" she asked, her eyes widening with fear. "Why would they hurt me? It's a long story," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "And you're too young to understand right now. But someday when you're older, we'll tell you everything." She seemed satisfied with that answer, but I knew it was only a temporary fix. The questions would keep coming, and eventually I would have to tell her the truth. The weight of the secret was heavy, a burden that I carried with me every day. I worried about how it would affect May, how it would shape her view of the world, how it would influence her relationships with others. I knew that I couldn't keep it from her forever. She deserved to know the truth, to understand her history, to make her own decisions about her family. But I wanted to protect her, to shield her from the darkness that had tainted our lives. One evening, as I was tucking her into bed, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with trust and love. "Mommy," she said softly, "I love you. I love you too, sweetheart, I whispered, kissing her forehead. Mommy, will you always protect me? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Always, I said, my voice firm. I will always protect you no matter what. That night, I made a decision. I would tell her the truth, but I would do it in my own time, in my own way, when I felt she was ready to hear it. I would tell her about Jane, about her twisted obsession, about the sacrifices we had made to keep her safe, but I would also tell her about the love that still existed within our family, about the hope that someday things might change, that we might be able to reconnect with the people we had left behind. The weight of the secret was still heavy, but I no longer felt alone in carrying it. Dan was there, by my side, sharing the burden, offering his love and support. And together we would help May understand her past and build a future filled with hope and resilience. May was 10 years old when we decided it was time. 10 felt like the edge of childhood, a moment before the world's harsh realities began to seep in. She was smart, perceptive, and increasingly curious about the world around her. She deserved to know. We started slowly, laying the groundwork. We talked about families, about how they come in all shapes and sizes, about how sometimes families can be complicated and hurtful. We told her stories from our childhoods, carefully edited to omit any mention of Jane. We watched documentaries about difficult historical events, about the Holocaust, about the Civil Rights Movement. We talked about injustice, about prejudice, about the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, as we were sitting around the dinner table, I took a deep breath and said, May, there's something we need to tell you. Something about our family. She looked at me, her eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. Dan reached across the table and took my hand, his touch reassuring. It's about your grandparents and your aunts and uncles, I said, my voice trembling slightly. The ones you've never met. Her eyes widened. What about them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. We started from the beginning, carefully and deliberately, explaining the situation in age-appropriate language. We told her about Jane, about her controlling behavior, about her twisted obsession with family traditions. We told her about the naming dinner, about the shattered wine glass, about the venomous words Jane had spewed. We told her about the switched pills, about the night in the hospital, about the fear of losing her. As we spoke, May's face registered a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a dawning horror. She listened in stunned silence, her eyes fixed on us, her body rigid with tension. She tried to hurt me? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. Yes, sweetheart, I said softly, but she didn't succeed. We protected you. We told her about our decision to cut ties with Dan's family, about our need to keep her safe, about the sacrifices we had made. So, I don't have grandparents? She asked, her voice filled with sadness. You do, Dan said gently, but they're not safe for you to be around. And until that changes, we can't have them in our lives. The silence that followed was deafening. May stared at us, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. She didn't say anything, but I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to process the enormity of what we had told her. Finally, she stood up from the table, her face pale and drawn. I need to go to my room, she said quietly. We let her go, knowing that she needed time to process everything. We found her later, curled up in her bed, sobbing quietly. We sat with her, holding her close, offering our love and support. We answered her questions. We reassured her fears. We validated her anger and her sadness. It took a long time for her to come to terms with what we had told her. She struggled with feelings of loss, of anger, and of guilt. She wondered if it was her fault, if she had somehow caused all of this to happen. We reassured her that it wasn't her fault, that she had done nothing wrong. We told her that we loved her and that we would always protect her, no matter what. The truth had been revealed, and the weight of the secret had been lifted. But the wounds of the past still lingered, casting a shadow over our lives. We would need to continue to process this as a family for the rest of our lives. The aftermath of revealing the truth to May was a period of intense emotional processing. We enrolled her in therapy to help her cope with her feelings of loss, anger, and fear. Dan and I also sought individual and couples therapy to address our own lingering trauma and to learn how to better support May. Therapy was difficult, painful, and often exhausting, but it was also incredibly helpful. It gave us a safe space to explore our emotions, to confront our fears, and to develop healthy coping mechanisms. May's therapist helped her to understand that Jane's actions were not her fault, that she was not responsible for the choices that other people made. She helped her to develop strategies for managing her anxiety, for setting boundaries, and for asserting herself in difficult situations. Dan and I learned how to communicate more effectively, how to support each other during times of stress, and how to create a more stable and loving environment for May. We also learned how to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we had made, for the secrets we had kept, for the pain we had caused. We practiced mindfulness, meditation, and other relaxation techniques. We spent more time in nature, hiking, camping, and swimming in the lake. We found solace in art, in music, and in literature. Slowly, gradually, we began to heal. The wounds of the past didn't disappear entirely, but they became less painful, less raw. We learned to live with them, to manage them, to move forward with strength and resilience. We also found support in unexpected places. We joined a support group for families who had experienced trauma, where we connected with other people who understood what we were going through. We shared our stories, we offered each other encouragement, and we found comfort in knowing that we were not alone. We learned that trauma doesn't have to define us. It can shape us, it can change us, but it doesn't have to control us. We have the power to choose how we respond to it, to learn from it, and to grow from it. We learned that resilience is not about avoiding pain, but about finding the strength to cope with it, to persevere through it, and to emerge stronger on the other side. We learned that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of healing even the deepest wounds. We were a broken family, but we were also a strong family. We had survived the worst that life had thrown at us, and we had emerged stronger and more resilient than ever. We would never be the same, but we would be okay. We knew we could heal and come out the other side. Years passed. May blossomed into a bright, independent teenager, full of life and curiosity. She was aware of her past, of the shadows that had haunted our family, but she refused to let them define her. She excelled in school. She made close friends. She pursued her passions with unwavering determination. She was a testament to the power of resilience, a living embodiment of hope in the face of despair. One day, May came to me with a request that I never expected. "Mom," she said, her voice hesitant, "I want to visit Jane." I froze, my heart pounding with anxiety. "Visit her?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "I want to understand," she said, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "I want to know why she did what she did. I want to see if she's changed." I hesitated, my mind racing. The thought of May coming face to face with Jane filled me with dread. I was terrified that she would be harmed, manipulated, or re-traumatized by the experience. But I also knew that May deserved to make her own decisions, to explore her own feelings, to find her own path to healing. I couldn't protect her from everything. Dan shared my reservations, but he also recognized May's strength and maturity. He trusted her judgment, and he knew that she was capable of handling whatever she might encounter. After much deliberation, we agreed to let her visit Jane. We set ground rules. We would go with her. We would remain present throughout the visit, intervening if necessary. We would talk about it afterward, processing her emotions, and providing her with support. The day of the visit arrived, cold and gray. As we drove to the prison, I could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. The prison loomed on the horizon, a massive, foreboding structure that seemed to swallow the sky. We went through security, our hearts pounding with apprehension. We walked through the long, sterile corridors, the silence broken only by the echo of our footsteps. Finally, we reached the visiting room. It was a large, impersonal space, filled with tables and chairs and separated by a thick pane of glass. We sat down at a table, our hearts racing. A few minutes later, Jane entered the room. She looked older, worn, and defeated. Her eyes were dull, her hair was graying, and her face was etched with wrinkles. She sat down opposite us, her eyes fixed on May. "Hello, May," she said, her voice barely a whisper. May stared at her, her expression unreadable. The air crackled with tension, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. This was going to be difficult, and it was going to dredge up so many feelings for everyone. "Hello, May," Jane repeated, her voice a raspy whisper that barely carried across the partition. May's expression remained unreadable. I could see the gears turning in her head, processing the woman in front of her, comparing her to the monstrous image we had carefully painted over the years. "Hi," May responded, her voice firm but laced with a tremor I could barely detect. "I wanted to ask you some questions." Dan and I sat silently beside her, hands clasped tightly in our laps, ready to intervene, but determined to let May lead. "Questions?" Jane's lips twitched in a semblance of a smile. "About everything?" "Yes, about everything." "Why did you do it, Jane? Why did you try to hurt my mom and me?" "Over a name?" Jane's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame. "It wasn't just about the name, May. It was about—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It was about control. About feeling like I was losing my family. I felt like Amelia was taking Dan away from me, and I couldn't stand it. It was stupid, I know. I was jealous. So selfish." May leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Jealous? So you tried to kill me because you were jealous? That doesn't make any sense." Jane flinched. "I didn't want to kill you, May. I swear. I just wanted to scare Amelia, to make her understand that she couldn't just come into our family and erase our traditions. Scare her? You could have killed her." "You could have killed me!" May's voice rose, cracking with anger. "Did you even think about that? About what that would do to my dad? To all of us?" Jane's eyes welled up with tears. "Yes, I did. And I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I truly am sorry. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I understand now how wrong I was. How selfish, how cruel. What changed?" May asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why are you saying all this now? Prison changes you, May. It forces you to confront your demons. And I've had a lot of help. Therapy, support groups. I've learned to understand my anger, my insecurities, my need for control. I'm not the same person I was then." "But you're still in prison," May pointed out, her voice sharp. "I deserve to be," Jane admitted, her voice barely audible. "I did a terrible thing and I have to pay for it. But I hope that one day, maybe, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." May stared at her, her expression conflicted. I could see the struggle in her eyes, the battle between her anger and her compassion. "I don't know if I can forgive you," May said finally, her voice trembling, "but I'm trying to understand. That's why I came here. But you made me really angry by threatening me as an unborn child." A long silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. May and Jane continued to stare at each other, two women connected by blood and tragedy, separated by glass and regret. Then May stood up. "Thank you for talking to me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to go now." She turned and walked away, her head held high, her shoulders squared. Dan and I followed her, our hearts aching with a mixture of relief and apprehension. As we left the prison, May was silent, lost in her thoughts. We didn't push her to talk, knowing that she needed time to process everything she had experienced. This would need more time than one visit to heal. Later that evening, she came to us, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't forgive her yet," she said, her voice trembling. "But I think maybe I understand her a little better now. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but May had opened the door, just a crack, to the possibility of healing. The prison visit had been a turning point, not just for May, but for all of us. It had forced us to confront our past, to examine our feelings, and to consider the possibility of reconciliation. May's act of reaching out to Jane, however tentative, had stirred something within us, a longing for connection, a desire to heal the wounds that had divided our family for so long. We began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to reconsider our self-imposed exile. We talked to our therapists, weighing the pros and cons, exploring our fears and concerns. We discussed the possibility of contacting Dan's family, of testing the waters, of seeing if they were willing to meet us halfway. The thought of reaching out filled me with anxiety. I was still wary of Karen and Tom, still unsure if they had truly understood the danger that Jane posed. I was afraid of being hurt again, of having my trust betrayed. But I also knew that May deserved to have a relationship with her grandparents, her aunts and uncles, if that was what she wanted. And I knew that Dan longed to reconnect with his family, to rebuild the bonds that had been broken. We decided to take it slow, to proceed with caution, to set clear boundaries, and to prioritize May's safety and well-being above all else. First, we wrote a letter to Karen and Tom, a simple, heartfelt message expressing our desire to reconnect. We didn't mention Jane, or the past, or the pain that had divided us. We simply said that we missed them and that we would like to see them again. We waited anxiously for their response, our hearts pounding with anticipation. Days turned into weeks, and still no word. I began to lose hope, to fear that we had made a mistake, that the wounds were too deep to heal. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely audible. "Amelia?" a familiar voice said on the other end. "It's Karen." My breath caught in my throat. "Karen?" I said, my voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "How are you?" "We got your letter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. It meant the world to us. We talked for a long time, catching up on the past few years, sharing stories about our lives, and carefully avoiding any mention of Jane. Karen seemed genuinely remorseful for her past actions, and she assured me that she understood the need for boundaries. She promised that she would never do anything to jeopardize May's safety, and that she would always respect our decisions. We agreed to meet, just the four of us, Dan, May, Karen, and Tom. We chose a neutral location, a park halfway between our house and theirs. As we drove to the park, I could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I was terrified of what might happen, of the emotions that might surface, of the possibility that we were making a mistake. But as I looked at May, sitting in the back seat, her eyes filled with hope and anticipation, I knew that we were doing the right thing. We owed it to her, to give her the chance to connect with her family, to build her own relationships, and to make her own decisions about her past. The path to reconciliation would be long and difficult, but we were willing to walk it. For May, for Dan, and for ourselves. We were willing to risk being hurt again, in the hope of finding healing and connection. The meeting in the park was awkward, tense, but ultimately hopeful. Karen and Tom were visibly older, their faces etched with wrinkles and lines of worry. But their eyes still held the same warmth, the same love for Dan, and, I could now believe, a genuine affection for May. May, initially shy, quickly warmed up to them. She peppered them with questions about their lives, their hobbies, their memories of Dan as a child. She listened intently to their answers, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Karen and Tom, in turn, were captivated by May. They marveled at her intelligence, her wit, her kindness. They told her stories about her father, about his childhood antics, his dreams, and his unwavering love for her. We set clear boundaries. Jane was never to be mentioned. Any attempt to contact us through her would result in an immediate end to the visit. We emphasized that May's safety and well-being were our top priorities. Karen and Tom agreed without hesitation. They seemed genuinely relieved to have us back in their lives, and they were determined to do everything they could to rebuild our relationship. The meeting lasted for several hours, And as it drew to a close, I felt a sense of peace. The tension that had been building for years began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. We started seeing Karen and Tom regularly, for Sunday dinners, for holiday celebrations, for May's soccer games and school plays. We invited them to our house, and they invited us to theirs. Kim and Andy, Dan's other siblings, were overjoyed to have us back in their lives. They embraced May with open arms, showering her with love and attention. They shared their own experiences with Jane, their own struggles to cope with her behavior, and their own hopes for a brighter future. Slowly, gradually, we began to rebuild the bridges that had been burned, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, and to create a new, stronger, more resilient family. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and occasional flare-ups of old resentments. But we persevered, committed to each other, and determined to create a better future for May. We learned that forgiveness is a process, not an event. It requires time, patience, and a willingness to let go of the past. It also requires a commitment to creating a new future, one based on love, trust, and respect. We learned that family is not just about blood, but about connection, about shared experiences, about unwavering support. It's about being there for each other, through thick and thin, no matter what challenges life may bring. Years passed. May grew into a confident, compassionate young woman, preparing to embark on her own journey, to pursue her dreams, and to make her own mark on the world. Today, I look at our life, at our family, and I see a circle, not a line. The past still exists. The scars still remain, but they are a part of our story, a testament to our strength, and a reminder of how far we have come. Jane remains in prison, serving out her sentence. We have had no contact with her, and we have no plans to ever see her again. May, now an adult, has made her own peace with the past, but she has chosen not to forgive Jane. Dan's parents are still a vital part of our lives. They are loving, supportive, and fiercely protective of May. They have learned from their mistakes, and they have become stronger, more resilient people as a result. Kim and Andy are thriving, pursuing their own careers and building their own families. They remain close to us, offering their unwavering love and support. And May is the light of our lives. She is a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, and a testament to the power of love. She is also a constant reminder of the importance of protecting those we love, of fighting for what is right, and of never giving up on hope. I still have moments of fear, of anxiety, of doubt. The trauma of the past will always be a part of me, but it no longer controls me. I have learned to live with the fear, to manage the anxiety, and to embrace the hope. I have learned to forgive not just others, but also myself. I have learned that the greatest act of love is to protect those who are vulnerable, to stand up for what is right, and to never let fear triumph over hope. Our story is not a fairy tale. It's a story of pain, of loss, of betrayal. But it's also a story of resilience, of hope, and of the enduring power of love. And as I look at May, as I watch her embark on her own journey, I know that we have succeeded. We have protected her, we have nurtured her, and we have given her the tools she needs to thrive in a world that is often dark and dangerous. We have given her the greatest gift of all, the ability to love, to forgive, and to hope. And that is a legacy worth fighting for. The scar may be there for all of us, but we can learn to live with them.